At the airport, my mom hugged my sister and said, "Have the best time in Vegas. You earned this trip." Then she turned to me and said, "Someone had to stay behind and be responsible." My dad tossed me the house key and said, "Don't mess anything up." I nodded, wheeled my bag back to the parking lot, and smiled as my passport was scanned at a gate 3 terminals over. They had no idea I booked my own one-way first-class ticket. I, 26M, stood in the terminal watching my family disappear through security, their excited chatter fading into the busy airport noise. Mom had hugged my sister tight and told her to have the best time in Vegas, that she'd earned this trip. Then she turned to me with that familiar look of expectation and said someone had to stay behind and be responsible. Dad tossed me the house keys with his usual gruff reminder not to mess anything up. I nodded like the good son I'd always been, wheeled my bag back toward the parking lot, and smiled as my passport got scanned at a gate 3 terminals over. They had no idea I'd booked my own one-way first-class ticket. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they flew coach to Vegas for my sister's graduation celebration, I was settling into seat 2A with a glass of champagne, watching the same city grow smaller beneath us. The difference was they'd be coming back in 5 days. I wouldn't. Growing up, I'd always been the responsible one. When my sister crashed Dad's car at 17, I was the one who covered the deductible from my summer job savings. When she flunked out of her first college, I helped her transfer to a cheaper school and tutored her through her makeup courses. When she needed an internship, I pulled strings with my contacts to get her positioned at a marketing firm. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone became about celebrating her latest achievement while my successes got mentioned in passing. I graduated summa cum laude from business school. She barely scraped by with a communications degree. I landed a position at a Fortune 500 company straight out of college. She bounced between part-time jobs and unpaid internships. Yet somehow, she was the one getting the Vegas graduation trip while I got handed house-sitting duties. The final straw came 3 months ago during Sunday dinner. My sister announced she'd finally gotten a job offer at some startup. The family erupted in celebration like she'd just won the Nobel Prize. Mom immediately started planning this Vegas trip as a reward. When I mentioned I'd just gotten promoted to senior analyst with a 30% raise, Dad changed the subject to ask if I could help my sister move apartments. That night, I made a decision. I'd spent years being the reliable one, the one who cleaned up messes and got taken for granted. Time to see what happened when I stopped playing that role. I started planning my exit strategy. First, I researched job opportunities in other cities. Seattle looked promising. Lower cost of living than our expensive hometown, better career prospects in my field, and 3,000 miles between me and my family's dysfunction. I applied to several positions and landed 3 interviews. While my family planned my sister's Vegas celebration, I quietly accepted a senior manager position at a tech company in Seattle. The salary was 40% higher than my current job, plus relocation assistance. I gave my current employer 2 weeks' notice, citing family reasons for the move. Next, I handled my living situation. I'd been renting a house from my parents at below market rate. Another way they kept me tethered and dependent. I found a tenant to take over the lease through a property management company, ensuring my parents would still get their rent without needing my involvement. The week before their trip, I sold most of my furniture and shipped the rest to Seattle. My family assumed I was just decluttering. I opened new bank accounts, transferred my assets, and changed my mailing address. I even pre-wrote my resignation letter for the family group chat, time to send after my plane landed. Sitting in first class, watching the clouds roll by, I felt lighter than I had in years. The flight attendant refilled my champagne and asked about my travel plans. I told her I was moving to Seattle for work, starting fresh. She smiled and said it sounded exciting. It was exciting. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions purely for myself. No family obligations to consider, no crises to solve, no expectations to meet except my own. My phone buzzed with texts from my sister about the hotel check-in and dinner reservations. I turned it off and enjoyed the silence. Tomorrow I'd be in my new apartment in Capitol Hill, preparing for my first day at a job that appreciated my skills. They'd be recovering from their first night on the Strip, probably planning pool time and shopping. The plane began its descent into Seattle. The city looked clean and green from above, Mount Rainier visible in the distance. I'd visited once for my final interview and fallen in love with the coffee culture, the tech scene, the mountains so close you could drive there for weekend hikes. After landing, I took an Uber to my new apartment complex. The building was modern, with a gym and rooftop deck overlooking the sound. My unit came furnished temporarily while I got settled. It was smaller than the house I'd been renting from my parents, but felt infinitely more mine. I unpacked my single suitcase and laptop bag, set up my computer, and ordered Thai food from a restaurant down the block. While waiting for delivery, I composed the message that would finally let my family know I was done being their backup plan. The text was simple and direct. I explained that I'd accepted a job in Seattle and moved permanently. I mentioned that I'd found them a reliable tenant for the house and left emergency contact information for the property manager. I thanked them for the opportunities they'd given me and wished them well, but made it clear I needed space to build my own life without their constant expectations. I scheduled the message to send at 8 p.m. Pacific time, when they'd be getting ready for dinner in Vegas. Then I turned my phone off completely. The Thai food arrived, and I ate pad Thai while watching the sunset over Elliott Bay from my new balcony. For the first time in months, my shoulders weren't tense with anticipation of the next crisis I'd need to solve. Monday morning, I walked 8 blocks to my new office building in South Lake Union. The company occupied 3 floors of a gleaming high-rise, with views of the Space Needle and downtown skyline. My new boss welcomed me warmly and introduced me to the team. They'd been impressed by my portfolio and were excited to have me lead their expansion into new markets. The work was challenging and engaging, exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'd been craving. My colleagues treated me as an equal contributor rather than the family cleanup crew. We grabbed lunch at a poke bowl place and talked about upcoming projects, weekend hiking plans, and the best neighborhoods for happy hour. After my first week, I finally turned my phone back on. The notifications exploded across the screen. 17 missed calls from mom, 12 from dad, 23 from my sister. The voicemails ranged from confusion to anger to what sounded like genuine panic. The text thread told the whole story. Initially, they'd assumed I was joking. My sister sent laughing emojis and said I was being dramatic. Mom wrote back saying I'd better be home when they returned because we needed to talk about this attitude. By day 3, when they couldn't reach me and realized the house had new tenants, the tone shifted. Dad's messages became increasingly frustrated, demanding I call immediately and explain what I thought I was doing. Mom alternated between guilt trips about abandoning the family and angry rants about how selfish I was being. My sister's messages were the most revealing. She complained that I'd ruined her graduation celebration, that everyone was asking where I was, and she didn't know what to tell them. She accused me of being jealous of her success and making everything about myself. The lack of self-awareness was staggering. I crafted one final response, sent to the family group chat. I acknowledged their messages and explained that my decision wasn't made in anger or jealousy, but from a need to prioritize my own growth and happiness. I told them I'd been feeling taken for granted for years and needed distance to build relationships that were more balanced and mutual. I wished them well and said I hoped they could understand my choice, even if they disagreed with it. I made it clear I wasn't cutting them off permanently, but needed time and space to establish my independence. Then I left the group chat entirely. The relief was immediate and profound. For years, my phone had been a constant source of anxiety, always ready to deliver the next family emergency or obligation. Now it was just a phone again. Update 1. 3 months into my new life in Seattle, I'd settled into a routine that felt authentically mine. Work was going exceptionally well. I'd already been given additional responsibilities, and my boss hinted at a potential promotion within the year. My colleagues had become genuine friends, and we'd started a weekly hiking group that explored different trails around the Cascade Mountains. I'd also started dating someone I met through a coffee shop book club. She was a software engineer at another tech company, and we bonded over our shared love of science fiction and terrible puns. For the first time in years, I was building a relationship without family interference or commentary. My apartment had transformed from the sterile corporate housing into something that reflected my personality. I'd bought actual furniture, hung artwork from local artists, and even adopted a cat from the shelter. The little tabby had been returned twice for being too independent, which made us perfect roommates. The city itself had exceeded my expectations. I discovered amazing restaurants in neighborhoods like Fremont and Ballard, spent weekends at Pike Place Market, and even taken up sea kayaking on the Sound. I was building a life based on my own interests rather than family obligations. My phone stayed mercifully quiet regarding family drama. I'd received a few more angry messages the first month, but they'd eventually stopped when I didn't respond. I did get updates occasionally through mutual friends and social media, though I'd unfollowed my immediate family to avoid the temptation of checking their posts obsessively. From what I gathered, my sister had moved back in with my parents after her startup job didn't work out. She was apparently between opportunities again, which explained why my absence as the family problem solver was probably being felt more acutely. I felt a twinge of something that might have been guilt, but mostly I felt validated in my decision. The pattern was so predictable, it was almost comical. Crisis emerges, family scrambles. Someone remembers I used to handle these situations. They get frustrated that I'm not available to fix everything anymore. Update 2. 6 months after my move, I received an unexpected call from my aunt, Mom's sister, who I'd always been close to. She'd gotten my number from the property management company, claiming a family emergency. Initially, I was worried something serious had happened, but it turned out she just wanted to check on me. My aunt had always been the black sheep of the family, moving across the country for art school and building a career as a photographer. She understood the suffocating nature of family expectations better than anyone. She told me she'd been proud of my decision to leave, even if she couldn't say so publicly without causing family drama. She filled me in on what I'd missed. My parents had apparently spent months complaining to extended family about my disappearing act, painting themselves as bewildered victims of an ungrateful son. My sister had bounced between 3 more jobs and was now back to asking for financial help with her rent. But my aunt also shared something interesting. My mom had apparently been bragging to her friends about my new job and salary in Seattle, conveniently leaving out the part where she tried to guilt me into staying home to babysit the house instead of supporting my career advancement. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable but unsurprising. More importantly, my aunt told me that several family members had privately expressed understanding about my decision. They'd watched the dynamic for years but felt unable to say anything. My disappearing act had apparently sparked some uncomfortable conversations about favoritism and expectations. She asked if I'd consider talking to my parents if they approached me differently, maybe with less anger and more genuine interest in repair. I told her I wasn't opposed to eventual reconciliation, but it would have to involve acknowledgement of the patterns that drove me away and commitment to change. I also shared how well things were going in Seattle. I'd gotten that promotion, my relationship was deepening, and I was happier than I'd been in years. I wasn't looking to prove a point anymore or punish anyone. I just wanted to live my life without constant crisis management. My aunt promised to pass along my perspective to anyone who asked, but respected my boundaries about not sharing my contact information. She also mentioned she might visit Seattle for a photography project, which I genuinely looked forward to. Update 3. A year after my Vegas departure, I received a letter in the mail from my mom. Not an email or text, but an actual handwritten letter forwarded through my workplace. The formality felt appropriate somehow. The letter was different from her previous communications. Instead of anger or guilt tripping, it was reflective and, surprisingly, somewhat apologetic. She acknowledged that they'd taken my reliability for granted and hadn't properly celebrated my achievements. She admitted that the Vegas trip situation had been unfair and that they should have included me in the celebration instead of assuming I'd be content with house-sitting duties. She wrote about missing our conversations and wanting to understand my perspective better. She asked if I'd be willing to talk on the phone, with no agenda except reconnecting. She also mentioned that my sister had started therapy and was working on some of her patterns around responsibility and independence. I sat with the letter for several days before responding. Part of me was skeptical that real change was possible, but another part missed having family relationships that weren't built on dysfunction. I decided to call her. The conversation was awkward at first, both of us unsure how to navigate this new dynamic. But it was also more honest than our interactions had been in years. She asked about my life in Seattle without immediately pivoting to family drama. I told her about my job, my relationship, my cat, the hiking group. When she asked if I was happy, I realized I could answer with complete sincerity that yes, I was happier than I'd been in years. I also told her that while I missed aspects of our relationship, I didn't miss the constant pressure to solve everyone else's problems. She listened without getting defensive, which was progress. She asked what would need to change for me to consider visiting. I told her that future interactions would need to be more balanced, with genuine interest in my life rather than just expecting me to fix things. I also said I needed to see evidence that the family dynamics had actually shifted, not just apologies. The conversation lasted an hour and felt like a tentative first step. She didn't ask me to come home or make any dramatic promises. We agreed to talk again in a few weeks and see how it went. I hung up feeling cautiously optimistic, but also protective of the life I'd built. Seattle had taught me what healthy relationships felt like, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice that for the comfort of familiar dysfunction. 2 weeks later, my sister called. The conversation was shorter and more difficult. She was still processing her own role in the family dynamics and wasn't ready for the kind of honest conversation Mom and I had managed. She was hurt that I'd left without talking to her directly, and I understood that pain even if I didn't regret my decision. I told her I hoped she was finding her way and that I'd be open to rebuilding our relationship when she was ready for something more balanced. She wasn't there yet, but I appreciated that she'd reached out. Final update. 18 months after my one-way flight to Seattle, I flew back to my hometown for Christmas. It was the first time I'd returned since leaving, and everything looked smaller somehow. The house I'd grown up in, the neighborhoods I'd known so well, even the problems that had once seemed so overwhelming. The visit went better than I'd expected, but wasn't without challenges. Old patterns tried to resurface. My sister attempted to rope me into mediating an argument with my parents about her job situation. My parents made a few comments about how much easier things were when I was around to help with logistics. But this time, I had boundaries and the confidence to maintain them. When my sister tried to pull me into the middle of her drama, I told her I cared about her, but wouldn't be taking sides or solving problems that weren't mine. When my parents hinted about moving back to help the family, I redirected the conversation to my actual life in Seattle. The difference was that these boundary-setting moments didn't turn into big fights. They were just clear communications about what I would and wouldn't do, delivered with love, but without negotiation. My family was learning to work around my boundaries rather than trying to bulldoze through them. I spent Christmas morning with them, then drove to see my aunt and several cousins who'd always respected my autonomy. The contrast was striking. With my immediate family, conversations still felt somewhat performative and careful. With my extended family, I could just be myself without managing anyone's expectations. I flew back to Seattle after 4 days, and the relief at takeoff was telling. I'd enjoyed seeing everyone and was glad we were rebuilding relationships, but I was even more glad to return to my chosen life. My girlfriend met me at the airport with the cat carrier, since my pet sitter had a family emergency. We drove back to our shared apartment. Yes, we'd moved in together 6 months earlier, and yes, it was going wonderfully. We'd also gotten engaged, though I hadn't shared that news with my family yet. I wanted to enjoy the happiness without their inevitable attempts to take over wedding planning. Sitting in my living room, looking out at the Seattle skyline with my fiancé and cat, I reflected on the journey. That day at the airport felt like a lifetime ago, when I'd been so angry and desperate to escape. Now I felt peaceful and intentional about my choices. The revenge aspect of my story wasn't really about punishing my family, though I'd certainly enjoyed their shock at discovering I wasn't available to be taken for granted anymore. The real revenge was building a life so fulfilling that their drama couldn't touch it. I'd learned that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply stop playing your assigned role in other people's dysfunction. My family had expected me to stay in place, solving problems and managing crises while they celebrated other people's achievements. By refusing to remain available for that dynamic, I'd forced everyone to grow and adapt. My parents had learned to celebrate my sister's successes without diminishing my contributions. My sister was slowly learning to handle her own responsibilities without a safety net. I was learning that love doesn't require sacrifice of your own well-being. The house keys Dad had tossed me that day at the airport were supposed to be a symbol of my obligation to stay behind while others lived their dreams. Instead, they became the moment I realized I could choose differently. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be taken for granted anymore. I'd never regretted boarding that flight to Seattle. The only thing I regretted was waiting so long to put myself first.